December 26, 1996, at 5:52 a.m., Boulder County Police Emergency Dispatch receive a frantic call from a mother claiming her daughter has been kidnapped. The woman says she awoke to find a ransom note laid at the bottom of a staircase and her 6-year-old daughter gone. What ensued would become one of the most bizarre and controversial murder investigations in modern history, the facts of which are still highly disputed to this day. It has been over 20 years, and the case remains officially unsolved, with investigators stating that due to the circumstances of their investigation, justice may never be served. You're listening to Creep It Real, and today we're discussing the 1996 murder of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey.
Creep It Real is a weekly podcast where we present our theories of the subjects we cover based on our interest and research. Some material may be graphic and disturbing, so proceed with caution.
Before we begin, we just want to thank everybody for joining us. This is our first episode of Creep It Real, and we are super excited to be here.
The purpose and reason behind this podcast was to bring some fresh perspective to some of our longtime favorite cases. We hope we can open your eyes and ears to some unknown details that may give you a better understanding for our enthusiasm for this case.
We know that JonBenet Ramsey is not a case that has never been covered before. It's been covered pretty extensively, but at the same time, it has been over 20 years, and like I said in the opening, the case is still unsolved. And this is a sadistic murder of a 6-year-old little girl in her own home. In our opinion, it's just as worthy of more coverage as any other case. It wasn't until we began researching for the podcast that we began to realize the facts we'd known of this case were generally information the Ramseys' PR machine and attorneys distributed to the public. The only possible purpose of this would be to mislead them. So we had to ask ourselves why.
Ashley and I feel passionately that because this case was never solved and that the killer was never caught and that the whole entire case is just shrouded in so much mystery and doubt, that it's very important that we keep these facts live and get people to still think about this in hopes of maybe bringing some sort of justice someday.
Exactly. While there were a lot of unprecedented events in this case, the most glaring to both of us was the complete and utter lack of cooperation from the Ramseys and the district attorney with the Boulder Police Department. We'd always been told this was a hugely mishandled case by the Boulder Police Department, who were on a witch hunt for the Ramseys. The truth actually appears much more sinister than that. So let's get into some of the background information before we start. John and Patsy were married in 1980. Patsy was a former beauty queen herself. She graduated from the University of West Virginia. John graduated from Michigan State University and was a former Civil Engineer Corps officer in the Navy. Burke was born in 1987. JonBenet was born in 1990. The family moved to Boulder in 1991 as John became the president and CEO of Access Graphics, a company that he began, which was a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. Patsy was a stay-at-home mom. She began entering JonBenet in pageants, where she was very successful. They also entered their home in a Better Homes and Garden tour of homes multiple times in a few different holidays. They were very prominent and wealthy members of the Boulder community who were extremely preoccupied with image and projecting an all-American family image to the public. Now we thought it would be good to give you a little background information on the kids themselves. Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's brother, who was a couple years older than her, he was 9 at the time of her murder, and JonBenet was 6. In the 3 years prior to her murder, JonBenet had visited the pediatrician 33 times for urinary tract infection issues. The family explained this as a side effect of wearing tights in pageants. I think we can pause here to talk about this for a second, because I talked to about 15 different women who had a background in dance or pageants who wore tights on a regular basis, and none of them had ever heard of having issues like this, nor did they experience them themselves. And I know Shai was also a dancer herself.
Yeah, it's true. I did a lot of ballet and other dance types for almost 12 years. The tights that you wear, too, aren't the flimsy, sheer nylons you buy from a Walgreens egg. They're really sturdy and tight, but never had any issues myself and never had any friends or fellow dancers that had these issues.
Right. And you have to think, If your daughter is having chronic issues to the point where she's almost in 3 years going to the doctor one time a month, that because of tights, that you would think, okay, I might need to find an alternative for these tights, or not have her wear something that is making her have these terrible issues go on for 3 years. It's just a little excessive.
Yeah, what an embarrassing issue too, you know, like I can't imagine being a little girl and just having to deal with that type of thing at that age.
Right. It's definitely a little out of the norm. It also coincides with both of the children having issues with bedwetting. This went beyond normal ages, and it was very frequent. This also could be a side effect of UTIs, stress, or any number of causes, but it's worth mentioning whenever you take this into consideration with a lot of the other facts that we'll be presenting to you. Burke also had some issues with defecating in his pants in weird areas of the home. He even, supposedly, according to their housekeeper, he pooped in JonBenet's bed one time and she found it there. So, you know, that is also just a little strange.
At that age, accidents, I don't know, I haven't raised a child from infancy myself, but you would think that this is a huge issue and needs to be addressed. This isn't normal behavior,
right.
You know, like...
It wasn't every once in a, you know, he accidentally pooped his pants at age 9. It was a recurring thing.
It was almost intentional.
Yeah, it does seem that way for sure. A year prior to her murder, JonBenet had a birthday, and a couple days later, Burke ended up hitting her in the face with a golf club, and it resulted in pretty significant injuries, as you may expect, that actually required plastic surgery. This is just kind of like a bizarre little detail of their relationship.
Yeah, it's important to know the dynamic between the two. This wasn't a happy, I love my little sister, I will protect her type brother-sister relationship that you come to sometimes see. And I mean, all siblings have quarrels, and even me and my little sister, we got into it a few times, but I never intentionally was out to like hurt her in such a way.
I mean, that's just a pretty aggressive thing to do to your little sister. Just stating facts here.
It's not throwing a ball at her head, out of like, even, it's
or even
you're taking
hitting,
a whack at
yeah, even hitting them with your own hand. It was obviously, it was a child-sized golf club, but it was still an actual golf club that you would use to go play golf with. It wasn't plastic.
It did enough damage to cause a need for plastic surgery. Like, that was...
Definitely just a little disturbing. Again, the family cited it was an accident. It just seems like a pretty serious accident, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, coinciding with that little tidbit, Patsy's parents, the Paws, had actually purchased 2 books for the Ramseys. One entitled Children at Risk, and the other was Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong.
A lot of parents, they buy parenting books, especially when you have first-time parents or you want some extra help. But these kind of seem, and while the titles aren't, like you said, worrisome, the titles are a little intriguing, because I don't think you buy these types of books just because you have a normal family life. Like, there is something obviously going on.
Right. There obviously was some issue in order for her parents to buy them a book entitled Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong. There's probably something going on. Who knows what, but obviously a hit in the head with a golf club, some abnormal urinary and defecation issues, incontinence. And then right before her murder, on the evening of December 17th, Patsy called the pediatrician 30 times, but it was never determined why. And that's, who knows why, but that's a lot of calls to the pediatrician.
At that point, why, if something like that was happening, why wouldn't you not just take your child to the ER?
I don't know. Maybe because you don't want anyone to know about it.
Exactly.
So that's all the little background information that I think we really need to go into at this point. We're going to talk about now just the day before the murder, the day leading up to the murder was Christmas, and the family awoke early to open presents. They kind of just lazed around the house until late afternoon when they began to get ready to go over to their good friends Fleet and Priscilla White's house for Christmas with their family. They got there about 5 o'clock and ate a crab dinner. Everybody hung out with each other. Kids hung out adults hung out, and then around 9:30, they left. And the parents said that they dropped off a few Christmas gifts at a few friends' houses, and then they went home. This is where there were a couple different stories. Immediately following the murder, John Ramsey had said that JonBenet was asleep in the car. He put her in bed upon arriving home, and then put a toy together for Burke, and they went to sleep. He later stated that they were both awake in the car. He read both of them a story, and then he put a toy together for Burke, and then they went to sleep.
John Ramsey also said that he had taken a melatonin before he actually laid down to go to sleep. And I think that's important when we get later into the story with the theory of kidnappers, because melatonin isn't some hardcore sleep aid.
Yeah, this isn't like Ambien,
yeah.
Gone to Mexico in your sleep.
Yeah.
No, Jean and Patsy said they fell asleep around 10:30. And everything that happened between then and the next morning when Patsy supposedly woke up is a complete mystery, and all we can do is theorize. I will say one more thing, and that was that the family was scheduled to fly out the next morning for Christmas with Jean's older children to Michigan. So that was the morning of the 26th. They were supposed to fly out super early in the morning to go to Michigan with John's older children and the rest of his family.
Patsy has said that she set an alarm for 5:30 a.m. so that they were making sure that they were up and ready too as well.
Yes, and this was a private flight. They had a plane and a private pilot that they were going to fly with. Now we're going to get into like the actual crime. Here is the 911 call that Patsy made at 5:52 a.m. Take a listen and we'll discuss how we feel about some of this stuff.
911 emergency.
Police.
What's going on?
By 515th Street.
What's going on there, ma'am?
We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please.
Explain to me what's going on, okay?
There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's blind. 6 years old.
How long ago was this?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says FBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Patsy Ramsey. I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
I'm sending an officer over, okay?
Please.
Do you know how long she's been
No,
gone?
I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please.
Okay,
Please, there's somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath,
Please,
okay?
hurry.
Patsy? Patsy? Patsy?
I just think it's weird to say we have a note left. Kind of just strange in my opinion.
Yeah, she's just, when you hear the call and you listen, it's like she's just trying to go through the motions to get this over and done with. Let's get this show on the road.
Yeah. So in the call, Patsy says that she looked into her daughter's room and then found the note. Later, to the cops, she'll say that she found the note and then went to JonBenet's room.
Originally, the note was said to have been found at the bottom of the stairs at their spiral staircase on like the bottom tread.
The next thing that I want to point out, the 911 operator says, "Does it say who took her?" And Patsy says, "What?" And I can't tell you how many times that I've heard a FBI agent say that if you ask somebody a question and they answer back with a what or a question, that 90% of the time they're just deflecting to try to think of something to say. Possibly, I do understand whenever your daughter is supposedly kidnapped, you're going to be stressed out. I get it. You're not always going to be thinking clearly. So maybe you just are flipping out and you say what. But you just put all these little things together. They come to make a bigger picture that just doesn't really sit well with me.
Having listened to a lot of, 911 calls when there's a child involved or missing or something, usually the caller is panicked and just wants the 911 dispatcher to understand. Like, they're almost so frustrated that the dispatcher is still asking questions and, they know my daughter is missing. What part of that don't you get? Send help. It's
right.
Instead it's, huh? What? Like,
yeah.
I don't know.
Also, another interesting little tidbit is that she doesn't even use her daughter's name in the whole call. I've read some analysis about this, and 911 operators that have listened to this have found that to be odd. But, again, we can't dictate how someone should act in this situation, and maybe she just didn't even think it was important to mention her daughter's name, but she never said her name.
Right.
It really feels like she's, with her words, that she's trying to distance herself from the kidnapping and from her daughter. And again, they have not searched this house for JonBenet at all at this point. So they called 911 before searching the home. Maybe that's normal when you find a ransom note, but it still seems like you would just, to be sure, you would search your house for your daughter when you can't find her.
Yeah, and it's hard to say personally what exactly your first reaction would be. Well, I mean, hold on a sec. When do you want to say, like, how Nancy didn't even read it, but...
Patsy?
Nancy. Yeah.
I did that same thing last week. I called her Nancy.
I want to call her Nancy so bad.
So does it say who took her? Patsy says, what? And then Patsy says, it says SBTC victory. So Patsy has said it herself in the call that she did not read the note before she made the 911 call. And at this point, John is supposedly on his hands and knees reading the note at the bottom of the stairs. Patsy's in the kitchen at her little phone hutch on the phone with the 911 operator. So I'm really not sure how she even got to the point where she was able to see that it says SBTC victory at the bottom of the third page of the note.
Right, because at some point it was said that the note was on the floor in like a kitchen hallway, just left there to be trampled on or whatever.
Mm-hmm. She stated, I did not read the note, but she knew the last line of the note somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then Patsy, the other noteworthy part of this call, Patsy thinks she hangs up the phone, and any of us that are maybe over the age of 25 and over can remember the good old days when we had cord phones that you put up on the kitchen wall, and if you just put it on the little
cradle,
the little cradle, just right, it wouldn't actually hang up the phone sometimes. So you would think you hung up, but you didn't. And this is exactly what happens when Patsy thinks she hangs up the phone. She puts it on the cradle just a little wonky, and it doesn't actually hang up. And then you hear some fairly indecipherable talk, but you do hear some words, and you definitely 100% hear three different voices. So you hear Patsy, perhaps, that part's pretty clear, saying, help me, Jesus, help me, Jesus. You hear a little boy's voice, I think you would say, if you hear it, really listen, it's a little child's voice saying something that might sound like, well, what did you find? And then you hear John, a man's voice, say, we're not talking to you.
So when you hear this voice say, well, what did you find? It's such a childlike tone and demeanor. If you've ever talked to a child that has done something wrong and they don't quite feel like they're busted yet, you've probably heard them say something close to that. And the way the voice sounds to me is like a child that's about to be in very big trouble, almost hopeless, very almost wanting to come off as innocent type tone. There's
Right.
no adult to it.
No, it is a child's voice. You really can't deny it. And so that is what I want to emphasize here, that because I know that there will be people who will say, you can't make out what they said. And they did send the audio to a company that actually specializes in enhancing audio, and the investigators had a pretty unanimous conclusion, which was what we just stated. That said, my argument to the people who say, well, you can't hear what they're saying, so what difference does it make about this call anyway? Well, fine. I'll give you that. I'll give you that the words are fairly indecipherable, but in my opinion, that's irrelevant because you hear three voices on the phone call, and the Ramseys, John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey, John and Burke to this day say that Burke was asleep the entire time that they made the call. All morning, he was asleep whenever the police were there, whenever their friends arrived. Burke was asleep in bed the whole time. And if you listen to this call and you hear those three voices that they didn't realize were being recorded by the 911 operator still, you hear three separate voices. So John was accounted for, Patsy's accounted for. Who is the third voice? Who, if Burke was asleep, if Burke was really asleep the whole time, who is this third voice that sounds like a little kid that's in their house that they never told anybody was there?
Exactly. And just having, been around like kids growing up and even being a kid myself, I never really remember sleeping in past like 8 p.m., especially, if my parents were up. And let's not forget that there was an alarm set for 5:30 a.m., that Patsy and John's bedroom was upstairs, so having to walk around, there was some commotion going on. I don't think kids pass out that hard and sleep through this type of ordeal.
Right, and honestly, one of Burke's friends' mothers has stated that Burke wakes up really early. He was never awake. He was never asleep past 5:30 in the morning. So this was right around his wake-up time, yet he remained in bed for hours. So that's just interesting. And so the question I want to pose here is, why were the Ramseys so set on saying that Burke was asleep the whole time? Why did they want to adamantly say that Burke was asleep in his bed the entire time all of this stuff was going on?
Yeah, it makes no sense. So we can call BS on that one.
Yeah, and then the other part of him being in his room by himself the whole time is that they left him in his room and virtually had zero concern for his safety, even though supposedly a child kidnapper had gained entry into their home and stolen their daughter from her bed right out from under their noses. Yet Burke is asleep in his bed. He's fine. The kidnapper, who knows who it was? They wrote a note in your home. They could still be there for all you know. Yet you're just going to let your son stay in bed. You don't think to ask him if he had seen anything going on the night before, if he had seen his sister. You just leave him asleep in bed, just leave him alone. He doesn't need to know about any of this.
I mean, if it was truly an intruder, it would have to be more than one intruder too, to, not only gain access to the house, find a little girl's bedroom, get her out of bed, keep her quiet, go back downstairs, write this ransom note, and even having talked to the housekeeper, not personally, but just on record, she even said that the house was a very complicated floor plan, and if you did not know the blueprints or your way around, it was very easy to get lost, and it was kind of a maze of a home. People don't realize that how well off John Ramsey was. Their house was enormous.
It was a mansion. I mean, they have a private plane and they have a mansion, so it's huge. It was a 3-story house.
And to do all this in the dark, too.
Yes, exactly. So it was a very skillful team of kidnappers that came in, and they could still be hanging out, ready to snatch Burke away at any moment, but the parents didn't seem too concerned with that. So let's, real quick, before we go into any further details of what happened that morning, let's read the actual ransom note that was left on the staircase.
All right, so it starts out. Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. Make sure you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money, hence an earlier delivery, which was crossed out, and pickup of your daughter. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The 2 gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as the police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices. If any are found, she dies. You can try to deceive us, but be warned that we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions, and you stand a 100% chance of getting her back. You and your family are under constant scrutiny as well as the authorities. Don't try to grow a brain, John. You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. It is up to you now, John. Victory, SBTC.
Ooh-wee. So
It's like a novel.
it is. It's so long. The FBI stated that they had never seen a ransom note that long before. Ransom notes are typically very straight to the point, very bland, I guess you would say. Like, you don't want to give away who you are, what kind of personality you have. You don't want to make yourself seem more diminutive by calling yourself a small foreign faction.
Yeah.
You don't think of yourself as a foreign entity anyway. That's something that other people see you as being.
Oh, and even like the language usage, like I had to ask Ashley what attaché meant, and she had to correct me on how to say it, because I've never even seen that word. Like,
I'm sorry. Yeah, oh, well, I was like, it's just so
it's a far
pretentious.
cry from the typical ransom note you see with the pasted newspaper letters and the get to the point, like, give us your money, get your daughter back.
Right. Like, there was one point when you were reading where I started laughing because it's like, you first of all, it goes from being a kind of group, being written as a multi-person group, and then it devolves into like this first person, almost like they're nagging John Ramsey.
Right. This individual's like, John.
Get some sleep, John. Make sure you bring make sure you bring the right size bag, John. It's just very dramatic.
Get some sleep and eat your Wheaties, John.
Exactly. Just a little dramatic, like, cool it, lady, or man, whoever wrote this note, cool it, group of kidnappers. You sound way too dramatic. I think it may be okay to note here that Patsy had a history of dramatic performance. In fact, when she won Miss Georgia, she won also based off of her dramatic performance that she gave that evening. So she's a dramatic lady. Maybe these group of kidnappers were just trying to match the Ramseys' level of drama. I don't know.
Well, okay, and even I had to find a typed out like image of the note, because the actual note handwriting is so hard to read because it is so sloppy. Like the D's, the straight part on like a D is so squiggly, it doesn't even look like a D.
It definitely looks like somebody's trying to
disguise their handwriting.
Exactly.
Also too, I'm sure you've heard this before, but it has always kind of baffled me. The ransom amount they are asking for is such an odd and specific amount. And if they know as much about the Ramseys as they kind of cleat on to, know, they would know that he is worth way more than $118,000, which happened to be the almost exact amount of what he was getting for his Christmas bonus that year. So it would have been like no love lost if that money had never even come into his possession.
Yes, like a magazine actually put out a couple months before JonBenet's murder that his company, Access Graphics, was $1 billion company. So they probably had upwards of millions that they could give a group of kidnappers instead of having to split $118,000 between,
right,
however many people this foreign faction is comprised of. So that's just kind of some strange details there. The note itself kind of blames John and his business for this situation.
Right. So, I mean, there's been theories of like scorned employees. There was actually even one, I believe, guy that was questioned because there was some bad blood between him and John, but nothing ever came about.
No, he was totally cleared. No former or disgruntled employees were ever taken into much consideration as suspects.
I mean, even the poor housekeeper was being questioned. What an elaborate...
The Ramseys pointed their fingers at a lot of people just as possible suspects from the get-go. The note itself was written on Patsy's notepad and pen that were found directly beneath the kitchen phone where she made the 911 call. This is where she kept that notepad and pen and used it often, and the notepad actually had rough drafts of the ransom note in it, but they had been torn out, but you could see them marked on the pages that were below them. They actually were addressed to both Patsy and John, and then those were not used, and the actual ransom note itself was addressed directly to John.
Right.
John actually handed that notepad over to the cops right away. I don't think he really even knew that was where it was the note was written. The note itself specifies not to call the police or JonBenet will die, but yet Patsy calls 911 right away and doesn't mind that the uniformed police officers arrived to their house about 7 minutes later.
Exactly. And also, too, let's just for 1 second pretend this is a small group of people doing this. Cops show up, detectives, multiple people. If their house was truly being watched, as the note states, I've always, kind of noticed in these type of instances, they will put out like patrol to, go look for any suspect vehicles or people kind of circling or hanging around the neighborhood. That would instantly give these people away. But there wasn't any suspicious characters out and about. In fact, there was no disturbance in the snow, no forced entry coming up to the house, no fingerprints on the frost or on JonBenet's balcony door or railing, nothing.
Yeah, it makes it seem like somebody's sitting around watching their house, but obviously that's not the case. And the cops even wiretapped the phone because in the note it specifies that there's going to be a call between 8 and 10 a.m. from the kidnappers to give further details about the trade of money for JonBenet. So the other thing about the note is the use of the word "and hence" that Patsy actually uses in a Christmas card a year after the murder, which is kind of just an odd turn of phrase that I don't hear a lot of people saying "and hence" all the time. I have seen people use the word "hence," and I in fact do occasionally, but I don't think the "and hence" makes a lot of sense, and it's used in this ransom note, but also later in a Christmas card that Patsy writes.
It comes off as such a hoity-toity note, and hence. And it's like when people say "therefore," and it annoys me.
And also, it quotes movie lines at the end. It's just so dramatic and just a little strange. So let's go back to the morning of the 911 call. Patsy immediately, after she really officially hung up the phone, she called her friends, the Whites, she called a priest, and she called another set of friends to come over to, I guess, keep them company. I don't know if this is strange or not, though. Just from my opinion, I'm thinking that, maybe you just need support and maybe you need other people to come help you look for your daughter, but it also could be that you're trying to kind of create a barrier between yourself and the police.
Yeah, exactly. Create as much distraction as possible.
The police arrived 7 minutes after the 911 call. Officer French, who arrived on the scene, noted that John was fully dressed in the kitchen from the doorway at the front door. Both the parents said that they'd only searched JonBenet and Burke's rooms, and Burke was still asleep. They hadn't even woken him up to ask if he knew or saw anything regarding his sister, and they were not fearful for an intruder, as we'd mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Patsy initially said that she went to JonBenet's room before finding the note, as I stated, and then she told Detective Arndt, who arrived at the scene, that she went after finding the note. So her story just, that morning, her story is kind of...
So many inconsistencies, and you would think if you wanted something to be done and for your precious daughter to be found, you would have your facts straight and you would want the cops to know, and you would... Exactly
how it went.
Yeah.
The more information that you can give them, the
better.
And maybe closer you are to finding your daughter.
Right.
Once their friends, the Whites, arrived to the home, Fleet White was the only person on record that day that went through the house actually shouting JonBenet's name.
Let's, real quick, just a kind of a past tidbit here. I think Fleet did this because Fleet's daughter did end up going missing the year before, but she was found in the basement of his family home.
Yeah, she was just asleep, so I think he was kind of hoping that maybe this is the same scenario, that JonBenet is just asleep somewhere. I think he was actually technically the first person to go down there.
Yeah, and look in the basement. Okay, that's right.
Yeah, so the basement, like the train room, the wine cellar, they were all down in the basement area. And
again, no forced entry to any of these doors.
No. Fleet, as I said, he searched the home calling out for JonBenet, and when he went down to the basement, he noted that there was a broken window, but it did not appear to have been a recent break because there was no glass anywhere beneath the window. There was one little tiny piece that was on a suitcase, and he later found out that John had broken that window a month prior because he had locked himself out of the house, and he broke that window to get into the house. There was spider webs and dust and all sorts of stuff accumulated on this window in the corners. It's kind of a short, thin window. You couldn't be a huge person and get through it, but there was definitely no disturbance to any of the spider webs, the dust, or anything around that window to indicate that anybody actually got in the house that way.
Yeah, exactly. No signs of forced entry whatsoever anywhere.
Fleet also opened the door to the wine cellar. He could not find a light switch, and because he couldn't find the light switch and there were no windows in the room, he could not see anything. He said it was so dark you couldn't see a thing. He decided that because there were no windows that no one could have gotten in or out through that room, so he just decided to close the door behind him.
This door was protected by a large wooden block.
Kind of like is that like, so you slide it down into some slats to kind of lock it?
I believe so. The door to the wine cellar was protected by a wooden makeshift block at the top of the door.
Okay.
So a 6-year-old girl would have to get a step stool to move this and to get into this door.
Fleet White suggested that they take Burke to his house to be with his family that was in town for Christmas. He drove Burke over to his home, and he did not ask one question about what was going on and only played a Game Boy the whole drive over to his house. This is after waking up supposedly to find police and a bunch of people in his house because his sister was gone.
Which is odd.
Right. The police came to the White's house to do some preliminary questioning of Burke, and he, again, had zero questions about his missing sister. He showed zero concern for her well-being or where she was, and he was so preoccupied with eating a sandwich that they had to break during questioning. He also expressed excitement about going to Michigan, building a fire, and that there were more presents to open once they got there.
So there is not a care in the world for him right now. He just wants to play his video games and go to
his friend's house, or go to see his family for Christmas. But I know Christmas is an exciting time, and again, I don't think we're here to dictate how someone should handle a stressful crisis situation, but it just seems a little odd in relation to the situation that you wouldn't have any concern about where your sister may be or if she's okay. And so we felt the need to mention.
Right.
So as the family is being questioned by the police, just, very preliminary, just asking, because at this point, this investigation is considered a kidnapping. And so they're asking people questions about who they may feel is suspicious or could possibly have done this. And obviously, the crime scene isn't quite being cordoned off as the crime scene it should be.
No, there's people in and out. I mean, the victims advocacy group is in there kind of cleaning up behind police, erasing fingerprints and evidence. So it's kind of a hot mess.
When we say that, we're not saying that they were intentionally trying to clean up fingerprints, but they were going around cleaning the house and the kitchen.
They were trying to be helpful.
But if the police knew it was a murder scene at that time, that obviously would never have been able to happen.
Right.
And that morning, Officer French noted that Patsy was crying with her hands covering her face. And at one point, he observed her peering through her fingers at him, which is just so creepy, I have to say.
Honestly, it gives me chills. It's just more weird behavior coming from Patsy.
It's just strange as heck. And, I don't know why you would feel the need to peer through your fingers at the police while you're crying. I just don't understand why you would need to do that. Why you would even have the wherewithal to be worried about what the police were looking at you like, or where they were looking, or
where they were at in your house.
Yes. So that 8 to 10 a.m. window that had been noted in the ransom note came and went without anyone in the family saying anything, making any reference to it, nothing. It just came and went without anything being said. And that, again, is very odd to me. I would be standing around with the phone in my hand, so ready to pick that phone up that I would be, I would pick it up the moment it started ringing.
The behavior and the vibe of the entire house was just so strange that, in fact, when Officer Paul Reichenbach arrives at 6:10, Detective French actually briefs him and then tells him that there is something off. So the vibe and feeling is like palatable.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's something that isn't sitting right with the detectives that morning, for sure. And that phone call thing, it's kind of like, I mean, again, I'm not telling you how you need to react in these situations, but
Yeah.
if I order something online and get an email that it has been shipped to me, I'm like essentially waiting at the door that moment.
Right.
And if it were my daughter that I was supposed to be receiving a call to have my daughter delivered to me for some money, I think I would be, again, waiting like a crazy person for that phone to ring. So Detective Arndt noted that no one in the family noted anything about the call not taking place in her notes of the day. Around 10 a.m. also, Detective Arndt noted that John disappeared for over 1 hour while she questioned Patsy and friends in the solarium. She stated that before this, John seemed stressed but had a sense of humor, was talking to everybody. And after he disappeared for about an hour, he came back with a marked change in demeanor. He was silent, brooding, and almost seemed nervous.
I do find it very strange that a house full of detectives and police lose sight and whereabouts of a person directly connected to the case for an hour.
I think, unfortunately, because of the circumstances, that at this point, she was the only one left in the house, and the other officers had gone out to start canvassing. One of them was over at the Whites to question Burke. From my notes, it was pretty much Detective Arndt that was left at the house by herself at that point in the morning.
Yeah, still though, it's very odd to me.
It's definitely not something that you would think is pretty standard in these kind of situations, to have somebody disappear for over an hour. But it happened.
Yeah.
And at around 1 p.m., this detective sent Fleet and John to look around the house for anything that was out of place. So John and his friend Fleet start to look around the house for anything that might not seem right. And John heads immediately for the basement. Per Fleet White's account, John opened the door to the wine cellar and immediately cried out, "She's in here," before he turned on the light. That's per Fleet White, his very good friend's account, that he didn't turn the light on before he started screaming that she's in here. And this is when 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey's body is found, covered in a sheet, duct tape over her mouth. Her hands were tied with a rope very loosely over her head. There was a garrote around her neck, and she was cold and blue. She had been dead for a number of hours because rigor mortis had set in, so her hands were stuck above her head, and John untied one of her wrists and removed the sheet from her. She was wrapped in her favorite blanket, and her favorite pajamas were wrapped with her.
So this intruder, these kidnappers know what her favorite blanket looks like.
And they're sentimental enough to give it to her with...
Right.
Wrapped in another blanket.
It was very interesting, too, the way they found JonBenet's bed. The sheets were pulled back neatly as if she had gotten out of bed herself. It wasn't disheveled or, out of place. Nothing was really out of place.
Yeah. So it doesn't look like she was snatched necessarily out of bed in a way that caused her to struggle, or by somebody that she didn't want to go with. Yeah. So Fleet immediately bolted up the stairs, screaming for an ambulance. Barbara Fernie, one of the Ramsey's friends that was there, and Priscilla White, Fleet's wife, had been in the solarium with Patsy and the priest. And upon hearing Fleet's screams for an ambulance, the two women, Barbara and Priscilla, fled the room to find where he was. Patsy did not follow.
Which is, I'm sorry, but if they have found your daughter, why would you not be the first person to go see that? Why would you not jump up and immediately run and rush to your daughter's side?
Especially considering that he said he was crying for an ambulance. He didn't say we found her dead body down here. He said we need an ambulance, and your daughter could be clinging to life, and your voice may be something that can help her stay here with you.
Exactly.
But perhaps she didn't want to know what was going on out there. So John Ramsey bolted up the stairs, holding JonBenet at arm's length away from him. Their priest who was there, Father Holverstock, recalled John saying, and I quote, "I don't think he meant to kill her because she was wrapped in a blanket." That was John's first utterance when he came up the stairs was, "I don't think he meant to kill her because she was wrapped in a blanket." In my opinion, that sounds like an excuse. You're somehow trying to make excuses for the person that killed your daughter.
Exactly, which, how dare you? How could you?
How could that ever be your first inclination to forgive and make excuses for the person that killed your daughter? I understand maybe one day coming to such peace that you can find it in yourself, but that immediate reaction, I can't imagine would be anything other than, I'm going to find this person and kill them.
Exactly.
Unless there's some reason why you cannot kill the person. Unless there's some reason why you want to forgive the person who killed your daughter.
Which, as a father, your baby girl, your precious everything, no, you want that person dead. You want to string them up.
Even if you are just the most enlightened person in the world, I just don't think that the reaction you're going to have 30 seconds after finding your daughter's dead body with a garrote around her neck, her hands tied, and duct tape over her mouth, being that they didn't mean to do it.
Exactly.
So at this point, Detective Arndt had to tell John to go get his wife, and only then did she come into the room where John had laid JonBenet down in front of a Christmas tree. Patsy began to cry and scream for Jesus to raise her baby like Lazarus, and flung herself on the body.
Again, there's that Patsy dramatic flair.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to go from not even coming in the room to flinging yourself on the body and crying for her to be resurrected.
Yeah.
This is a good place to mention that statistically, 6% of child murders are perpetrated by strangers, and that number is even lower when they are killed in their own home.
So, just a small recap here. We have people that have gone into the basement, didn't see a darn thing, completely blacked out. Cops, detectives, people in and out of the house. Patsy's got some weird behavior going on. John's demeanor goes from almost not lighthearted, but not super stressed, to, like you said, brooding.
Nervous and irritable.
Nervous. And now we have the body.
At this point, John began making some phone calls. His first call was to his daughter's boyfriend, Stuart Long, who, according to Steve Thomas in his book, JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, stated that John told Stuart that he had found JonBenet's body at 11 o'clock and then again at 1 o'clock, okay? So this was something that Steve Thomas was like, wait a second, is this real? Are you telling me the truth? Are you sure you're not misspeaking? He made it very clear that he needed to know for sure what Stuart Long was telling him was true. And Stuart said, I am telling you that John Ramsey told me he found JonBenet's body at 11 a.m. and then again at 1 p.m. He found her body 2 times. One was the, initial finding of her body, and the second time was the official finding of her body where he brought her upstairs.
Which is such a, lack of better words, a poop show.
What was the purpose of not bringing her up the first time he found her is the question I have.
Exactly.
That aspect of it has always kind of made me think that perhaps John did not know the full scale of the situation until after the cops were actually in his house. He didn't know exactly what was going on, and he found her body and was like, I do not know what to do right now. Who is involved in this? What do I do? What am I supposed to do right now? And the second call that John made was to his private pilot, who, again, they were scheduled to fly to Michigan for family Christmas with. He began to discuss his need to fly to Atlanta for an important business meeting he could not miss. What?
Which, I'm sorry, your daughter is found dead in your home and you've got to go to a business meeting? No.
I know you're a bigwig, and perhaps even your meeting perhaps was about, how to protect your company in this time, but the last thing on anyone's mind, you would think, when they just found their 6-year-old daughter who had been strangled and who knows what else, would be that I need to go to this business meeting right now. Just very, very odd.
Yeah, it's not like an accidental death. This was like a
murder.
Intentional, grotesque murder.
Sadistic, nasty, terrible, horrifying murder.
Yeah.
So Detective
How dare
French,
you.
Detective French told him he could not leave and they needed him for questioning and information to help find the perpetrator of this murder. John also told his private pilot not to intercept his older daughter and son from their flights for some reason. He didn't. His pilot had offered to intercept them so that they didn't have to fly commercial and he could bring them straight to the Ramseys in Boulder. But John told him no, he didn't want him to do that. I don't know why, and it always has just seemed to me like he just wanted that plane free.
Yeah, exactly.
Why was John attempting to avoid interaction with the police and investigators regarding his daughter's murder and finding her killer? Why?
It makes no sense.
So that's everything leading up to finding JonBenet's body. And now we're going to discuss some of the evidence that was found in the home. The first piece of evidence was in the kitchen. It was a bowl of pineapple and cream on the counter. This pineapple and cream was noted to be Burke's favorite treat. And the bowl and the spoon, there was also a cup of tea in a glass. But these were all found to have Patsy and Burke's fingerprints on them. Both Patsy and Burke claim to have nothing to do with this bowl of pineapple and cream and the glass of tea.
But there had, upon, investigation, there was partly digested pineapple in JonBenet's stomach.
So perhaps Burke and JonBenet shared some pineapple the night before, but for whatever reason, Patsy is adamant that she did not give that to them and that Burke did not have this.
Which would be such an odd thing to feel like you needed to hide.
Yeah, but again, we're trying to distance Burke from this situation, whatever happened in that night and that morning.
Yeah.
The next thing was the notepad that was found. It was Patsy's notepad. It was used to write the ransom note. Like we said, there were rough drafts in there. The pen that was used was in the cup directly beneath the phone that was used to call 911. And it's kind of like one of those things where if you've heard this before, that when we're under stress, we fall into a routine.
Yeah.
And that seems like that was probably definitely what she was doing that morning.
Kind of go into autopilot and rely on old habits and, like you said, routine.
Yep.
You got to kind of shut your mind off.
So there was a hard frost on the grassy areas of the Ramsey yard. There were no signs of footprints, like Shai said earlier. The sidewalk and the driveway showed no signs of passing. CSIs tested the deck outside JonBenet's window, and they also showed no signs of disturbance.
Right.
Again, there was the broken window in the cellar room, which John admitted he had to break a month prior to gain entry to the home. Photographs showed, which you can look at online, and we can post them on our Instagram. The photographs show debris and spider webs, indicating there was no disturbance at this spot for quite a while. Mm-hmm. Another interesting thing found in the home, in the kitchen on the counter again, was a Maglite flashlight. It was wiped clean of prints, though I know that the handle is kind of in that kind of crisscross pattern that would probably be difficult to pick up prints anyway, but there were no prints on there. And the odd thing about this is that John and Patsy could not identify this as being theirs, even though their housekeeper and the Whites had both identified this as belonging to them, and that John's older son had gifted this to them. So other people knew about this flashlight, but John and Patsy, they said they could not identify it as being theirs.
And everybody knows what a Maglite flashlight is. If you have one, you know it. They're very heavy. They're huge. There's no mistaking that there's one in your house. It's not some junk flashlight you throw in the junk drawer and forget about.
It's enormous.
Yeah.
There were also chocolates with fecal matter found in JonBenet's room, along with a pair of pants that had fecal matter belonging to whom it was assumed was Burke because they were too big to be JonBenet's.
And these were found in the room as well?
Yes.
Okay, so he's pooping in chocolate boxes.
There was the pair of pants was pooped in, and then that was in her room, and the box of chocolates, I believe, was down in the basement.
Okay. Which, I'm sorry, there's poop in your pants and then there's pooping in a box of chocolates. Like,
yeah.
What kind of behavior is that?
That's definitely not an accidental situation. There was a broken paintbrush used to make the garrote found in the basement in Potsy? We're going to start calling her Potsy from here on out. There was a broken paintbrush used for the garrote that was found in the basement in Patsy's paint toolbox.
So the killer would have known that these objects were in the house, where to find them to fashion this crude garrote.
Right. It was not brought from outside the home. There was a rope and duct tape found in a neighbor's trash can in the alleyway, and this is the rope and duct tape used for the garrote and on JonBenet's mouth, the duct tape. There was a urine stain outside the wine cellar door, indicating that this was the spot where JonBenet actually took her last breath, as the urine stain is something that is indicative of your eliminating your bowels and whatnot upon death.
So the nylon cord that was around her wrist, it wasn't tightly bound, like they were trying to keep her wrist tied. And it was strange that it was also placed over the cuffs of her sweater that she was wearing, as if not to damage her skin.
It wasn't functional, for sure. That wasn't going to keep her under your control or out or immobile. It seemed to be loosey-goosey, kind of there for a visual.
Exactly.
Perhaps a cover-up. There was a high-tech boot print near her body, and there were friends of Burke Ramsey's who stated that he had a pair of high-tech boots, but they were actually never found in the home upon investigators searching for them.
Yep.
The high-tech boot print is very distinguishable. It actually says high-tech, and it's not something that you can kind of mix up with another shoe. It's definitely a high-tech boot, and that's all it is.
Yeah. So also, I did want to point out that Burke was a Boy Scout at some point, and I know that they learned to tie knots and tourniquets, when they're out in the field if something were to happen. And I actually looked up pictures of a Boy Scout tourniquet, how you would do something like that without the resources that you necessarily would need. And it does resemble the garrote that was used to suffocate. Yeah,
it really does.
It's almost scary, like it's eerie.
Yeah, we can put a picture of that as well, because it's definitely very similar to the garrote that was used on JonBenet.
Yeah.
A few more bits of information that we needed to talk about are that Patsy was wearing the same clothes as she was the night before at the White House, and her makeup was done.
Hair was done.
And that's after waking up super early to go get the family ready to fly out to Michigan, and then finding a ransom note unexpectedly at the bottom of a staircase.
Well, also, too, John Ramsey was fully dressed in some khakis and a blue and white striped shirt. I mean, so when do you find time to discover your daughter missing, call cops because of this crazy ransom note, and then go find time to do yourself up?
And I am a dirty bird, so I rewear clothes all the time, but I'm, not Patsy Ramsey, and she was, like we have discussed, she was very, very concerned with image and portraying herself as a, successful professional woman. And I find it odd that she would be wearing the same clothes as she was the night before. Even in this time of stress, I just find it odd. I personally wonder myself if she ever took them off.
Well, and I would understand maybe if there was reports of her, she was completely blasted at the party and just kind of passed out, but there wasn't, and she had put JonBenet in her pajamas, and so what was the reason for her never changing into her own?
Unless she just was like, hey, I'm not going to be around the same people today, I'm going to wear this favorite outfit again. And maybe she did. Who knows? But that's just a little bit of info. A neighbor, Melody Stanton, had reported to the police whenever they did their preliminary neighborhood questioning on that morning of December 26th that around 1 a.m. she had heard a female scream come from the direction of the Ramseys' house. She then later recanted that. I don't know why, but initially she told police that she had heard a scream around 1 a.m.
Why would you take that back?
Well, who knows? Police attempted to interview Patsy later that day over at the White House where she had gone to be with Burke, but her doctor, who had come to bring her sedatives, said she was too sedated and incoherent to be interviewed. I don't give a flip if I am incoherent from sedatives. If my daughter is missing and then found dead in my home, and I need to be questioned by police in order to somehow find justice for my daughter, I am going to answer questions, no matter if I'm barely able to keep my eyes open or not.
No, yeah, you want to find your daughter, and especially you want to find the killer. You want justice to be brought down upon his head. You know, he did something so vile.
Yeah. This is where we begin to see the lack of cooperation with the police by the Ramseys. Right. While they may state that they cooperated from the get-go, they answered preliminary questions at the house whenever the police thought that it was a kidnapping, and then they left their home and immediately began to not cooperate like you would expect a parent of a murdered child to cooperate with the police.
Yeah.
The day following the murder, before an autopsy or any info was released to the media, Burke was at a friend's house, and his friend was named Doug, and Doug's mom overheard the two boys talking about how JonBenet had been strangled, or more specifically, whether or not manual strangulation had been involved in her death. At this point, no news articles had disclosed the blow to the head or strangulation, so how did Burke know any of this information?
So,
especially as it seemed like he was being shielded from the situation.
He's showing no emotion of sadness or a loss either. He's talking about this as if it has, no anything to do with him.
Right. Actually, that mom, and we'll talk about her later again in another episode, but that mother actually said whenever she was listening to the two boys speak, it was as if it was about somebody on a television show and not somebody that was actually related to Burke, and it was fairly disturbing to her, to the point where she told a friend.
Right.
So that's like all I think the evidence at the house that I think we want to talk about at this point, unless there's something else that you want to add before we move on to the autopsy evidence.
No, that pretty much covers it. I think we got everything that's important and pertinent to exactly what is happening.
This is where it's going to start to get a little bit more disturbing. Definitely, if you have children, they probably shouldn't be listening to this in the first place, but it's time to get sensitive ears out of the room, because we're getting into a little more disturbing information regarding the autopsy and the physical evidence of JonBenet's murder. As I stated earlier, the ransom note kind of indicates that the motive for the crime is maybe revenge, greed, money, and as we get into this physical evidence, it's going to suggest that it was more of a sexually motivated crime.
Yeah.
And which is something that like the ransom note never even begins to touch on in any way whatsoever. They never say anything about anything to make you think that they had a sexual motive here, but the actual physical evidence suggests that there was somewhat of a sexual motive.
Right.
So as I said, whenever JonBenet was found, she had already been in rigor mortis, which gives it about a 8 to 12 hour window from the time of death. It suggests that she's perhaps was murdered and actually died between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., but because of the degree of rigor mortis and the fact that she was not past rigor mortis, she probably died closer to 12 a.m. than 6 a.m. On initial assessment, the cause of death appeared to be strangulation, as there was the garrote around her neck. But after beginning an autopsy, everyone in the room was shocked when her scalp was reflected back and there was blood swelling and a fracture was discovered. This was not outwardly visible, so anyone that had just seen her wouldn't have known that this had even taken place.
Exactly.
This fracture was caused by a blunt object being brought down on the upper right side of her head. Some objects around the home that were consistent with the shape of this fracture were the mag light, a golf club, and less so, a baseball bat found outside the house.
Yeah, so we have the blow to the head that has thought to have knocked her unconscious, and it is said that she would have remained alive for about 90 minutes, but the pathologist concluded that due to petechial hemorrhaging, it indicates that she was still alive during her strangulation with the crude garrote.
Right, so somebody knocked her unconscious with that blow, and then After being knocked unconscious, they applied that garrote to her throat.
Right.
She was, like we said, the garrote meant that somebody used a nylon cord and a broken handle of a paintbrush to wrap around her neck and twist to strangle her. The garrote was devised at the scene. The autopsy suggests as strands of JonBenet's hair were tangled into its knot, so it was absolutely fashioned there. They also found the garrote was applied from behind due to its rear-facing application, likely while she was laying face down in the hall right before the wine cellar. This is presumably the location where she died, as there was the urine stain I mentioned earlier on the carpet, and there was also a urine stain on the front of her pajamas. So, I mean, terrible. Just this alone is terrible. We have a little girl that was hit in the head so hard that she was knocked unconscious and her brain began to swell and bleed. And then somebody dragged her down into the basement of the home and began to choke her with a hastily made garrote in the hallway.
This is not the work of a well-conducted, planned-out intruder with multiple people. This is a panicked, hastily done job.
A well-thought-out plan would probably have you leaving the house as soon as you possibly could, not going down to a basement and conducting more weird, bizarre, horrible things down there. So, moving on, there were fingernail marks on JonBenet's throat, along with a triangular bruise. And this, from the autopsy, can be explained by somebody took JonBenet's collar and pulled it tightly around her neck, which then she dug her fingers into that collar and tried to pull it away from her neck, causing the fingernail marks and that triangular bruise from one of her knuckles. She had abrasions on her back that were twin small circular marks that could not be immediately identified, but these were later found to be a near identical match to the ends of a piece of train track that Burke had in the basement.
Let's not forget that the training room was downstairs as well.
Yeah, the train room in the basement and the wine cellar, again, were all down in the basement. Well, the basement's in the basement, just in case you had lost that little bit of info.
Yeah.
So there was the pineapple that was found partially digested in JonBenet's stomach, which the Whites had said they did not serve pineapple at their party. But again, there was the pineapple sitting on the counter in the kitchen the next morning. And even though Patsy vehemently denied involvement with her and Burke in getting the pineapple, JonBenet had it in her stomach.
Another forewarning, it's about to get even more disturbing. I think this is where the media gets super hyped, but we are going to talk about the sexual abuse that was found.
So the coroner, Dr. Meyer, discovered JonBenet's upper thighs and genitals had been wiped off. He thought perhaps to wipe away semen. Upon further investigation, he discovered it to be blood. The evidence suggested that the 6-year-old had been penetrated with the paintbrush, as they found dried blood and small fragments of the wooden handle in her vaginal orifice. The bleeding suggests the penetration occurred close to, but definitely before the time of her death. He also observed signs of chronic inflammation around JonBenet's vaginal orifice, believing these to have been inflicted in weeks or months prior to her death, based off the amount of healing that had taken place. Her hymen was shriveled and retracted, consistent with prior sexual contact, suggesting that someone who was close to JonBenet or her family was responsible for assaulting her in the weeks or months prior to her death.
Which would make absolute sense, considering that I know that you had brought up in our discussions that she had a chronic bedwetting problem, but it had cleared up, but it had gotten much, much worse about a month prior to her death.
Yeah, the housekeeper stated that she had completely stopped wetting the bed for almost a year prior to her death, and then the month before she had started it up again.
Yes.
So it definitely coincides with the alleged abuse that the doctor found. So, as we previously mentioned, JonBenet's hair was tangled in the knot, showing that it was fashioned spontaneously at the scene, not beforehand. This was not something that was brought into the house already fashioned and ready to go. This was not something that was planned. The duct tape that was placed over her mouth appears to have been done after the initial attack took place and she was already unconscious. There was mucus that had been smeared down her nose and across her cheek, and the tape was on top of that mucus. There was also a perfect set of lip prints on the tape, and had she been struggling, they would have appeared smeared and irregular. This was presumed to have come after the fact, in part of staging, perhaps, as were the wrist bindings, which were incredibly loose, as we mentioned, and they couldn't have prevented her from getting free if she were conscious.
There was also a very interesting piece of fabric found on the duct tape.
Yes, we will get into the evidence later that they find down the road, but there were enough fibers of a jacket of Patsy's on the inside of that duct tape that they stated that could not have been just an incidental, because she lives in the house, the fabric got on the duct tape. So, yeah, it was on the inside of the duct tape. So, based off of the forensics, when taking the sexual assault after unconsciousness with the paintbrush into account, one would think the motivation for the killing was of a pedophilic nature, which stands in contrast to the ransom note that stated that the motive was money and or power. So just to recap, there was prior trauma, there was a reoccurrence of chronic bedwetting, there was sexual assault just before death. Someone close to JonBenet is the one that had been perpetrating this in the weeks and months prior to her death. So who had the motive to do this to her this evening? Who had access to her? What is going on here? So, okay, let's just kind of rehash the proposed timeline here. The first order of events is that somebody grabs JonBenet by the back of her collar, pulling it tight and twisting. She reaches up and claws at her collar to pull away, resulting in fingernail marks and the triangular bruise from her knuckle, perhaps, on her neck. She was then released from the perpetrator's grasp, spun around, and was struck in the upper right-hand side of her head, knocking her unconscious, which accounts for the lack of defensive wounds on her body. She was then dragged or carried to the basement, where perhaps in her unconscious state, it gave her perpetrator the freedom to experiment more than they had previously. They inserted the paintbrush into her vaginal orifice, then fashioned a garrote around her neck while she was face down. They began choking her, and eventually this ended her life. Sometime between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., she was murdered. Who was in the house, and what happened from this time to 5:52 a.m. when Patsy made the 911 call? So that night, Burke's favorite treat, pineapple and cream, was left on the counter. A neighbor saw the kitchen light was on around 2 to 3 a.m., and a neighbor heard a scream around 1 a.m. and later recanted, but Okay, so obviously the crime scene was mishandled immediately, as the detectives were focused on a kidnapping per the family from the outset. So they went into this not thinking this was a murder. They thought this was a kidnapping and that the girl was alive, and they were actually waiting to make a trade of money for her. And as Shai stated earlier, the victim advocates came to the home that day and cleaned the kitchen, and all sorts of people were coming in and out of the crime scene. It wasn't secured, it wasn't cordoned off, and it wasn't until hours and hours later that they realized it was actually a murder, not a kidnapping. Was this the family's doing? Were they muddling the situation, muddling the crime scene, or moving focus from them to an outside party? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Although the Ramseys would repeatedly state that they were cooperating with police, they wouldn't come in for questioning for weeks. For weeks, they did not come in for questioning. The moment they left their home on the 26th, they halted cooperation with the police, as we've stated. On Friday, December 27th, the Ramseys' attorneys and personal investigators were already working the case before the autopsy. And they were trying to reach Fleet White immediately the day of the murder to speak with him. One instance that the Ramseys used as evidence of their cooperation was on the 28th of December when they underwent a collection of evidence with the police. This is just where cops come in. They're collecting photos of body, skin, etc. to see if you have any wounds on you. They're just collecting evidence from your body.
Right.
Under Colorado Revised Statute 41.1, it is stated that investigators cannot ask investigative questions during this collection, but could listen to anything that's said voluntarily by individuals they were collecting evidence from. As investigators collected photographic evidence of the Ramseys' arms, hands, etc., Patsy asked, "Will this help find the killer?" The detective responded, "They hope so." It's then that Patsy blurted out 2 times, "I didn't kill my baby." and her lawyer immediately rushed to her side and whispered something in her ear. Following that, she got tight-lipped and she fell silent. So the first thing about that is, like, nobody was suggesting that she had killed her.
Yeah, it was just blurting it out.
Blurting it out. And at this time that they were collecting this, all the evidence pointed to an intruder. There was restraints, there was a ransom note. It just seemed like a kidnapping. Why would Patsy feel it necessary to proclaim her innocence?
It's just nobody's questioning you. Nobody's said, hey, did you do this? It's just like it's a guilty conscience just blurting out. I mean, she may not have killed her daughter.
Yeah, this is a routine evidence collection that is done with anybody who has been in the same area of a crime like this. It's not like they weren't telling the Ramseys, what did you do to your daughter? They were just collecting photographs, and she stated twice that she did not kill her daughter. So this is where I want to talk about a little bit about something called an excited utterance or a spontaneous utterance. It's something that under federal rules of evidence, an excited utterance is defined as a statement that concerns a startling event made by the declarant when the declarant is still under stress from the startling event. An excited utterance, it is admissible under an exception to the hearsay rule. So it's something that when you're under stress in a stressful event and you utter something that could be perceived to be incriminating, and it is admissible in court. Anyway, that's just, again, another little tidbit that makes the situation seem rather dubious. So the family flew to Atlanta for JonBenet's funeral, and she was buried on the 31st of December. Even though the Ramseys had not yet cooperated in giving full interviews to the police of Boulder, they go on CNN on January 1st. So in this interview, Patsy is clearly high as a kite, and she's on meds that her doctor has admitted freely to giving her post-murder.
To me, I understand feeling depressed, anxious, all those things. You know, something very traumatic just happened and you just had to go to your daughter's funeral. But if you wanted people to help find the killer, bring justice, would you not want to be fully aware and show these emotions and be fully capable of going through these feelings and emotions?
Yeah, I mean, one would think that you don't want to delay the grieving process by
Doping
just getting
up
so high that you can't even speak correctly. But so anyway, so Patsy is high as a kite, admittedly. In her prescription-induced medicated state on CNN, she referenced O.J. Simpson and Susan Smith, the woman who drove her car into the lake with her children in it. She was aligning herself with two people who had brutally murdered members of their family. Whether you think O.J. did it or not, most people do think that O.J. murdered Nicole and Ron Goldman, and that, you know, it was a brutal murder. Yeah. Susan Smith was a woman who drove a car with her two living children into a lake and then claimed she didn't for a while. So here's Patsy's statement. You know, America has just been hurt so deeply with the tragic things that have happened. The young woman who drove her children into the water, and we don't know what happened with O.J. Simpson. And I mean, America is suffering because we have lost faith in the American family. We are a Christian, God-fearing family. We love our children. We do anything for our children. That's the end of the statement there. And again, why so defensive, Patsy?
And to, like you said, these weren't, accidental killings. These were brutal. These were intentional. These were some individuals, whether you believe O.J. did it or not. I mean, if he did, he clearly was sick in the head. The lady why would you even put them in the same category as yourself?
It is a very odd thing to do, and again, we have kind of what I believe might be, and what James Kolar, the investigator on the case, believes is an excited utterance.
Yeah.
After this interview, John stated that Fleet White was the one who suggested the interview with CNN, which was far from the truth. Fleet had grown extremely frustrated with the Ramseys' handling of events after the murder and could not understand why they were not cooperating with the police and why they were delaying interviews with them. He was so frustrated, in fact, that instead of flying back with the Ramseys and their crew on their private plane, he booked his own commercial flight back to Boulder. This is somebody that they're so close with that they go over to their house on Christmas to spend Christmas evening with them and the family that they have coming in from out of town. Yet this man is so disgusted by the way the Ramseys are handling the situation after JonBenet's murder that he doesn't even want to have a free private flight back with them. He books a separate commercial flight.
This speaks volumes to me. This is...
Yes.
That's something, considering how close the families truly were.
Yeah, they were extremely close. Obviously, they called them first thing whenever they found their daughter was missing. So very, very damning, in our opinion. After the murder, Patsy also began to change her handwriting. Shortly after the murder, the detectives went over to her parents' home where her mother complained that they were unfairly focused on her. So they asked her for a writing sample, and she thrust a paper at them of a list of names and numbers and addresses that Patsy had written that morning. In the name Barbara Fernie, the first A was written in manuscript style, and she'd gone back over it with a felt-tip pen, changing it to a cursive A. Investigators noted in the ransom note, which contained a total of a whopping 376 words, the small letter A had been printed in manuscript 109 times, written in lowercase only 5 times. This was clear evidence the author was attempting to conceal his or her handwriting style in order to be precluded from being identified. There was multiple instances after the murder of Patsy seeming to try to change her handwriting.
Yeah.
And again, she vehemently denied any knowledge of the pineapple and cream, even though both of her prints were found on the bowl. And is it because this proved that Burke and JonBenet had contact at a critical time in the timeline of her death? Perhaps. All right, so I think this is a good spot for us to stop today. This is a hefty bit of info for you to digest today before we get back into it in our next episode with the other information regarding the investigation that follows the murder and cover-up that we believe took place.
I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you learned some new things. Maybe your opinion and our own conclusions have been swayed a bit, which, not that we're trying to do that, but we don't think this case is as closed and shut as people had come to think. So
definitely not.
Hopefully, yeah.
So I am super jazzed that everybody stuck around with us this whole episode, and I am excited for you guys to join us on our second episode where we are going to be covering the investigation of the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and the cover-up that followed. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you soon.